close that door, please? Great. The way we're going to do this is the mics don't work except to be recorded, okay? Because if we have a loudspeaker in here, it would ruin the guys next door. So you will be recorded, and what will happen is that mic will be passed among the panelists. This mic here, I will give to the persons who ask questions at the end, okay? The way we'll do this is Michael will, I think I have it down. Yeah, I'll read it. But the point is that this will be, I think, uploaded to archives and maybe the internet as well. And it'll be Michael, then Bishop Paprocki, and then Mary, who's an attorney. I may have mentioned that last week.
You say that like it's not a good thing.
My father-in-law was an attorney, so I have to say it's good. Fran, I'm an attorney.
Oh, that's right.
Surrounded by attorneys.
I think I don't live in his diocese. Okay, so let's get going. And one thing that I do need to add is that we have a terrific new team, but very young team running this conference. I mean, this is John's last conference. We have a lot of new people who are actually the nuts and bolts of the thing, and so they're terrific. Long term, they're going to be excellent. Sometimes certain things get dropped. One of them is the books that were supposed to be here are not here, and it's not my fault. It's not Michael's fault. Somebody else's fault. Okay. So as long as that's clear, in everybody's mind, then we can begin. Okay, Bishop, could you start us with a prayer, please?
Sure.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, we thank you for the graces that bring us together here this evening to reflect on the life of the late Francis Cardinal George. We give thanks for the great witness of the faith that he gave in his life as a person, as a priest, as a bishop, and as the Archbishop of Chicago. We ask that his life may continue to inspire many people as he has inspired us here. And we ask that you be with us as we consider and talk about his life here today, that all we may do may be in fulfillment as Cardinal George wished through his episcopal motto to give glory to Christ in all that we do. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay, my name is Fran Maier, and I'll be moderating this evening's discussion. If my former boss, Archbishop Charles Shappy, were here with us this evening, he'd tell you that the smartest and finest American bishop in the last 7 decades, if not longer, was Cardinal Francis George, the late Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, who died in 2015. He was a mentor and personal friend to the Archbishop, a brilliant intellect, and a man of uncommon Christian character, a genuinely great church leader of real substance who's now sorely missed. Michael Heinlen captures all these qualities perfectly in his biography of Francis George, published earlier this year, Glorifying Christ, the life of Cardinal Francis George. And the Archbishop actually gave a terrific review of this, an excellent review of it on the First Things website in January. And it's worth reading the review because it will compel you to read the book. From personal experience, it's a terrific read. It's well worth getting a copy and spending some time with it. And in this case, I actually know what I'm talking about because I reviewed it for the Catholic Thing just a few months ago. The good news this evening is that we get to hear about it from the author himself, along with two people two good friends who knew Cardinal George very well from direct experience. With us today in their order of comments are Michael Heinlen. Michael is the author of the Francis George biography, the editor of Simply Catholic, a ministry of our Sunday Visitor Publishing, and a frequent contributor to The Priest magazine and other OSV publications. Bishop Thomas Paprocki of Springfield, Illinois. Bishop Paprocki served first as Cardinal George's chancellor, then as a pastor of a large parish near Chicago's O'Hare Airport, and later as one of his auxiliary bishops, and then as a suffragan bishop under the leadership of Cardinal George as Metropolitan Archbishop of the province of Chicago. Mary Helen FioRito is a civil attorney and was a friend, close advisor, and senior staffer for 28 years, or almost that long, for Cardinal George. She's now the Cardinal George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, though she continues to live and work in the Chicago area. After the panel presentations, we'll have a brief opportunity to, they'll have a brief opportunity to offer any additional comments, and then we'll take questions, which I'll manage with this, with this microphone, and we'll end promptly at 5:45. It's been a long day. So, Mike.
Thank you, Fran. It's great to be here, and I'm really privileged to spend some time with you talking about a man I only knew in passing, met him several times. He remembered my name because he had a photographic memory, but to spend some time also with those who worked with him and collaborated with him is a real honor. Who was Francis Eugene George? According to his own wishes, his gravestone memorializes him as Oblate of Mary Immaculate, Bishop of Yakima, Washington, Archbishop of Portland in Oregon, Archbishop of Chicago, and Cardinal Priest of the Holy Roman Church. Indeed, he was those things, but he was so much more. He was an accomplished academic, a former professor with 2 doctorates, an outstanding religious, a born leader, a go-getter. He possessed a razor-sharp intellect and a scintillating mind, and was widely respected and admired for his commitment, for his vision, for his sense of humor and convictions, for his example and encouragement of others who endeavored, like him, to answer the Lord's call. Nationally and internationally, in ecclesial life for decades, Cardinal George also had been president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and at that time had articulated clearly new threats to religious liberty posed by the presidential administration of Barack Obama. And through that, he united his brother bishops to stand up against it. His fingerprints can also be found among many of the most significant decisions made by the hierarchy in our country and abroad, everything from effecting reforms in the wake of the clergy sexual abuse crisis to the new English translation of the Roman Missal. Oblate of Mary Immaculate that he was, you have him to thank for any time you hear the word oblation in the Mass, because it was his insistence that brought about that translation of Latin's oblatio. But a catalog of achievements and contributions is about as easy as a Google search. As a biographer, I wanted to find out more. I was more interested in finding out who Francis George really was. What made him tick? What defined him? What makes him worth remembering? To that end, I was delighted when I came across a really small, obscure interview from the Yakima newspaper in 1992. It was a small Q&A spotlight, human interest level questions that painted a picture of someone in the local community in central Washington state. It was a fun little piece that offered some nuggets into understanding who George was, outside of those things that the media might have typically covered, like his favorite food was seafood and pasta. His favorite ice cream was chocolate. His favorite movie was 2001, A Space Odyssey. His favorite childhood memory was being carried on his father's shoulders through the snow. But a highlight of that interview for me was that George revealed his dream job would be to play the timpani in a symphony orchestra. Now, of course, the timpani is generally 4 kettle drums and an essential part of any orchestra. And as I got to know more and more about who Francis George was, this seemed like a fitting way to start classifying the main aspects of his character. He really was like a timpani. The timpani can roll in like thunder or fade into the background upon cue. The timpani is a leader, bold and resonant, but without domination. There can be a reticence to the timpani, a certain hesitancy too. And all of this was true for George's own ministry as a bishop. He spoke when he needed to, but he sometimes feared that he didn't speak enough. As I began to distill the treasure of who Francis George was, I began to see 4 characteristics emerge, like these timpani in the symphony. He was a man of perseverance. He was a true pastor. He was a prophetic voice. And he was a heroic disciple of Jesus Christ. Amid the many struggles he faced, Cardinal George was a man of perseverance that meant he kept moving forward no matter the roadblock that he happened upon, because he knew that God was alive and active and he must keep going. In a similar way, that's true of the timpani, I guess, because it reverberates just as Christ reverberated in Francis George's life. George was quintessentially pastoral. He was concerned about relationships and people, not careerism or advancement. He never dreamed of becoming a bishop. He often stayed at events so long that he was the last to leave, despite his very busy schedule. His time was not his own. He met with any priest who needed to see him within a day. That was his promise. He met with victim survivors of abuse, and many of them regard him as a model for pastoral care to them. He was attentive to the poor and to the margins. He caused a big ruckus wanting to sell the Archbishop's residence in Chicago because he thought he could live closer to the poor. And he often talked about how fundamentally forming people was what mattered more than anything else. Cardinal George was also a prophetic voice for the church, a man who could see things as they are and could unite the church when he spoke. He was always listened to, so many bishops told me, whenever he took the microphone at a bishop's meeting. He possessed an unusually brilliant mind, which he put at the service of proclaiming the truth and to unify the church in Christ. And finally, Francis George was a disciple. He taught who Christ is unhesitatingly, patterned his own life on him, and brought others to him. He desired that we give God glory through our discipleship and our worship and our witness. In short, as Archbishop Peter Sarton said in the homily at Cardinal George's funeral mass, Francis George was, quote, so utterly a Christian, end quote. So while Cardinal George had long attracted me with his wisdom, his clarity, his eloquence, his orthodoxy, and his objectivity, as I got to know him more closely, I found someone who emerged a little differently, a little more complex, a little more complicated, and I admired him all the more for it. So if I may, I'd like to just run a bit more with that thread, the last drum of his discipleship. Again and again, it stuck out to me how much he suffered in his life, and silently so. Suffering is like the unifying thread of his life and what really defines him in so many ways, what shaped his perseverance, what honed his pastoral skill, what gave him the knack for really getting the big picture and explaining it so well, and also what defined his ability to be such a faithful and heroic disciple of Christ. Francis George's suffering began at 13 with a bout of polio, which resulted in rejection from the seminary that he'd one day oversee as Archbishop in God's providence of his hometown of Chicago. The physical effects left him permanently disabled, a cross he carried his whole life, and a cross that got heavier in middle age when he had to start wearing a brace on his leg. It was very heavy and needed constant adjustment and left him in pain every day. That cross that he carried got heavier in the last 9 years of his life as he struggled with cancer, which ultimately took his life. But those 9 years were on top of all of the demands of his high-profile position, where he was being tugged in every direction, and also had a heart that was really wounded by the effects of clergy misconduct. But Francis George didn't just suffer. He was transformed by it. And I'd argue defined by it, because he truly understood that suffering was the means for him to do what we're all called to do, to glorify Christ. It was on the night before Christ died in his priestly prayer at the Last Supper in John's Gospel when Christ prays to the Father for those of us who endeavor to follow him. The Master said, I'm praying for them. I'm praying not for the world, but for those you've given me, because they're yours, and everything of mine is yours, and yours is mine, and I am glorified in them. His words to his Father on the night before he died. What is Christ really saying here? He's showing us that he is a shepherd concerned about his sheep to the very end. He is a shepherd who says that inasmuch as his sheep are his, he is glorified in them. And so that means, of course, we pray that he is glorified in us. Christ doesn't talk about what he did there or what he said as the litmus test of his shepherding. Rather, he talked about how we are holy because of him. And so this, of course, means that insofar as we are Christ's, insofar as we belong to him, we glorify him. And it's my assessment that Francis George did that above all else. He glorified Christ in his life, and he belonged completely to him. We know Christ tells us that our discipleship means following him and carrying the cross. And not just any cross, it's a cross that must be like Christ's. And Francis George was intimately acquainted with that cross. It's the common thread to the rich fabric of his fascinating story and witness. The cross Francis George carried his entire life is exactly how he glorified Christ. By doing so, he showed the depth of his virtue and discipleship. And really, isn't that exactly what we need now in the church and in the world? In an era when many will say how we've lost trust in the church and we've lacked transparency and how the church needs more role models of good holy priests and good holy bishops, I believe with all my heart that Francis George was that. His own longtime confessor confided to me he was a saint. I firmly believe Cardinal George is needed now just as much as when he was with us. And we live in a time when the church is divided anew, when our mission is stymied, something that Cardinal George greatly lamented, because that mission is stymied because we are paralyzed of our own division. And Cardinal George had a way of articulating the faith to show us what we really do need now, of helping the church move past divisions. And he proposed that what we needed should be shaped by what he called, quote unquote, simply Catholicism, not getting caught up in weaponizing realities, but uniting ourselves totally to Christ. Cardinal George's resignation was hastened in 2014 as cancer continued to take its final toll on him. That November, the boy who left his Chicago home on crutches in 1951, determined to be a priest, despite the rejection of his home archdiocese, left that archdiocesan cathedral that day on crutches yet again. But before he did that, he preached his final homily at Holy Name Cathedral, and he responded to persistent questions about his legacy at the end of his time as archbishop. He spoke nothing of his robust tenure as one of the most respected bishops in our nation's history. Instead, he diverted the question back to Christ. Quote, "At some point, Christ will question me, 'What have you done with my people? Are they holier because of your ministry? Are they more generous, more loving toward others? In short, you are my legacy.'" He continued, "The people of the archdiocese are what I will point to when the Lord asks me, 'What have you done with my gift to you?' The people of the archdiocese are what I will point to when media and others ask, 'What is your legacy?' Have I at times been too fearful to speak, to act, to love generously? Sometimes, certainly. But others can note that even when I don't. But have I invested myself in the people so they are better able to know and live their faith, able to worship God in spirit and in truth, able to give themselves for the salvation of others? Yes." End quote. It fascinates me that Francis George himself, such an accomplished man that he was, wanted only to be remembered as a conduit for Christ's action in the world, as one who encouraged his people to glorify Christ in all that they do. And he gave a lasting example, I believe, of how to do it. At the end of his life, when he was asked how he wanted people to remember him 50 years after he died, Cardinal George hoped his people would, quote, "Remember, I tried very hard to love them." That's what a bishop is supposed to do. That's what a parish priest is supposed to do. Love the people whom God has given you to pastor, to care for, end quote. And isn't that what we need to see when we look at the crucified Christ? In all that he did, in all that he said, Francis George gave witness to all of that contained in the crucified Christ through his person, by making an offering of his life, an oblation. He lived the Catholic faith purely and with integrity. Because he was completely Christ, because he glorified Christ by his life, Francis George was someone who could articulate the faith very clearly, who disposed his brilliance to the service of the church, who brought unity to his brother bishops, who was committed to reform, who was honest and accountable, who was genuine and authentic, who was holy and simply Catholic. Because he was completely Christ, he was a man for all, and I believe will remain so for all ages. And his witness will continue to bear fruit, because it is life-giving. So I believe that any close examination of Francis George's life makes clear that above all else, he glorified Christ. I hope that we can learn from the example he left us, and by the help of his prayers, persevere in becoming completely Christ's too. To Christ be glory in the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to start out by thanking Michael Heinlen for writing this book on glorifying Christ. And I'm going to give a little plug. I do hope you take the time to read it. Reading it myself brought back a lot of memories and wonderful times that I had with Cardinal George and many things that I learned from him. And as I was going through it, I was always highlighting a lot of the quotes that you had from Cardinal George that I'm going to go back to and use. But I want to give you credit for that, too. It was not easy getting quotes from Cardinal George because he often spoke off the cuff, very impromptu remarks. I remember one time I was with him at a USCCB meeting. It was a June meeting, which is more like a retreat, and he was going to be one of the speakers. And I was sitting next to him, and the previous speaker was up there giving the talk, and I'm sitting next to Cardinal George, and he's scribbling on a little piece of paper in front of him. And I leaned over and I said, "Are you writing your talk?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." So it was time for him to go up and talk, and he went up to the dais, and the previous speaker was standing at a podium, but he sat down because of the impact on his leg, the disability that he still had from having polio when he was 13. So he sat down at a table like this with his head down, and he often spoke that way. He did not have good eye contact because he was always kind of thinking. He was in his head very much. And so he's sitting in front of a microphone like this, and he's talking in full, complete, coherent paragraphs. It was just amazing. And I knew all he had in front of him was a little scrap of paper. So afterwards, he gives this brilliant talk, and I had bishops coming up to me saying, "Can I get a copy of that?" And I'll see what I can do. So he comes down from the table that I said to him, "Some bishops are asking for a copy of your talk." He hands me the scrap of paper and says, "Here." And I said, "That's what I was afraid of." Fortunately, they video recorded that talk, and so that's how we do have some quotes from him. But as Fran said in the introduction, I did serve in various capacities with him. I started as the Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Chicago under Cardinal Bernardine until he died, and then Cardinal George kept me on as his chancellor until the end of my second term. And then he asked me to be a pastor. And I'm very grateful to him for asking me to do that because looking back, I think he wanted me to have some pastoral experience before becoming a bishop, and that was very wise on his part. But I was pastor only for 2.5 years of a big parish, but some of the happiest years of my life, so it was a great experience to do that. And then became auxiliary bishop under him. And the auxiliary bishops each had a portion of the archdiocese, so I had 1/6 of the archdiocese working with him in that. And then in 2010, I became Bishop of Springfield in Illinois. And so with him as my metropolitan, I continued to serve with him until he retired, going to the meetings of the province that we would have and that he would chair. And so 20 years ago on this past March 19th, I was ordained a bishop by Francis Cardinal George at Holy Name Cathedral. And I draw great significance from the fact that both my appointment as auxiliary bishop and my appointment as Bishop of Springfield in Illinois did not come, but the notice of that did not come to me from a phone call from the Apostolic Nuncio. It came from Cardinal George. And I've talked to other bishops, and almost every bishop I talk to will say, they'll talk about the day they got the phone call from the nuncio appointing them to be a bishop. You know how you always remember where you are. Well, when you get that phone call, you're becoming a bishop, it changes your life. So I remember I was pastor, and I was actually going out the door, and my secretary says, there's this phone call here I think you want to take as Cardinal George. So I go back into my office, and it's the Cardinal, and he says, well, he was always right to the point. You're being appointed auxiliary bishop. Oh, okay. He says, well, you're not surprised, are you? I said, well, I mean, you hear rumors, but I mean, would you? So I said, could I have some time to think and pray about it? And he says, yeah, why don't you go to the chapel and call me back half an hour? I said, well, can I have a little more time than that? Like maybe tomorrow I can call you back? Or then he got worried that I was going to say no. So he starts giving me this little fervorino. He says, this is coming from the Pope. The Pope is appointing you to be a bishop. You shouldn't say no to the Pope. I said, no, I understand. I just need some time to digest this. So indeed, I made an appointment and met with him the next day and obviously said yes to that. But then also when I was being appointed to Springfield, the same thing. This time I was on my way to O'Hare, and I get a message that the Cardinal needs to talk to me before I get on the plane. He knew I was going to Rome. So I'm in the terminal at O'Hare. And I get him on the phone. He says, oh, good, I'm glad I got you. He says, can you talk? I said, well, yeah, I'm in the terminal at O'Hare. What's going on? Again, right to the point. Well, you're being appointed Bishop of Springfield in Illinois. Well, okay. I said, I'm going to Rome, and I'm going to go to the audience on Wednesday. Can I? Do I say anything to Pope Benedict? I'd say thank you. Whatever. He says, well, you have to be careful. This is still in their pontifical secret. So you want to make sure nobody overhears you. So I said, okay. So I go up there, and it was during Holy Week, actually. There's not much for auxiliary bishops to do during Holy Week. So I was able to go to Rome during Holy Week because the Cardinal would do all this liturgies at the cathedral. So there's only 4 bishops there, and I'm the junior in seniority, so I'm the last one going up there. And so I go up to Pope Benedict, and I say, well, I understand you've just appointed me Bishop of Springfield in Illinois, and I want to thank you for that appointment, and assure you I'll try to do my best. And Pope Benedict is smiling, and I'm thinking, I wonder if he has any idea where Springfield, Illinois is. But I also think that I wound up in Springfield because of the influence of Cardinal George. One of the trips, I took several trips with Rome, with Cardinal George. One of them, we were going to Rome. I think it was early in his time in Chicago, because I think it was, in fact, when we were going for his, when he was becoming a cardinal, and he was going for his red hat. And I helped organize a pilgrimage. We had 900 of his closest friends go with him to Rome when he got his red hat. And so we're on the plane, and I'm reading a book, like this reading. And he was always very curious and intellectually. So he leans over and he said, what are you reading? And I said, well, I'm reading a book about Abraham Lincoln. And he says, oh, you like Lincoln? I said, yes, I do. I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. So I think that stuck in his head. When Springfield came open, he probably, we'll send Paprocki there. He likes Springfield. But I mentioned those little stories or anecdotes because I think that gives you an insight into the kind of person he was and his pastoral side. Michael mentioned the four characteristics of Cardinal George: his perseverance, his pastoral leadership, his prophetic voice, and his true discipleship. And so that was the pastoral side of him that I would imagine, I don't know for sure, I should have asked him at some point, but imagine Cardinal George saying to the nuncio, no, let me call Tom. I want to tell him myself. And I really do appreciate that personal touch that he had. And that's the kind of person he was. I've heard from others, other bishops, that sometimes he would just call them late at night and ask, how are you doing? And he had that personal concern about people. He gave matters his personal attention. 2 thoughts that come to mind from the Vesper service with priests the night before his installation in 1997, when he said, pick me up when I fall. And he meant that literally, because of his leg, that he would just sometimes fall. And then he also meant it figuratively. Sometimes if I fall in what I'm supposed to be doing, let me know. And then, so I was, again, on a trip to Rome, might even be that same trip. We were a long day, and at the end of the day, we just wanted to go for a walk through the Vatican Gardens. And we're walking and having a chat, and all of a sudden he just collapses. He just falls. And he was short, so he's close to the ground, so he didn't fall very hard. I helped pick him up, and he brushes himself off, and we kept walking and talking. So that's the way he was. And then the other thing he said was, don't be put off when I ask questions. And that's the kind of person he was, his background in philosophy. He always loved to ask why. And not in a way that, and he explained that, he says, I'm not challenging you necessarily. He says, I just really want to know why. You say you want to do something, I want to know why you want to do that. Another experience of his pastoral side, I was with Cardinal George in Rome for the Synod of America in 1997, and it was supposed to be the whole month. And after about 3 weeks, I got a call from my sister that my father was dying. And Cardinal George says, go home. You need to be with your father. And he just arranged for a Cardinal Lost priest secretary to fill in for me while I was gone. So I was like, don't worry about me. I'll be fine. You just go home and be with your family. That's the kind of pastoral side that Cardinal George had. Regarding his asking questions, another anecdote, I remember one of the first meetings he had with the departmental directors of the Diocesan Curia and the auxiliary bishops. We had the head of Catholic cemeteries coming and giving a presentation. And Catholic cemeteries in the Archdiocese of Chicago is a big deal. And it's a profit center, actually. And it's well organized. And so Monsignor Pat Pollard, you know, gives this presentation, and his buttons are popping. You know, we got the great cemetery system. And at the end of it, Cardinal George said, I came from Yakima, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. We don't have anything like that out there. Just people buy a grave, the priest blesses the grave. He says, what if we just sold all of our cemeteries and used that money for Catholic schools? Well, Monsignor's heart just about stopped. It's like, and so, and I think he was kind of half serious. You kind of mentioned that in your book about how he really was so concerned about the schools, that can we use all that money for schools? So I'm going to the elevator after the meeting back to our offices, and I said to him, Your Eminence, you just about gave Monsignor Pollard a heart attack. He said, I know, I was just playing with him. I said, I know that, but I don't think he knew that. At the press conference in 1997, when he was introduced as the Archbishop of Chicago, he was asked to describe the difference between himself and Cardinal Bernardine. And his response was very simple. He said, well, Cardinal Bernardine was a Southern gentleman. I'm a Chicagoan. There were no more questions. And it was the end of the press conference. Everybody kind of knew what that meant. All right. So I'll give you an example of that. So I mentioned I became a pastor, and so one of the things I did, I had a series of vocation talks. And I had different people come in and talk about it was about their vocation. So I had like a permanent deacon and a religious sister. I talked about diocesan priesthood. I asked him to come in and talk about being a religious priest, and tell them why you became a religious priest. So he says, well, I became a religious because they wouldn't take me at Quigley. The diocesan seminary. I said, well, don't say that. I mean, give a little bit more, So he gave a very nice talk, actually, about his vocation as a priest. And afterwards, I had this reception. I had a lot of young people at this evening talk, and we had a little reception afterwards, and somebody crashed the party. A couple of people there with a clipboard and a petition that they wanted him to sign. And they come right up to him, and I'm ticked now because they're crashing my party, and I want him to be talking to the kids, not to them. But they got this clipboard, and he grabs it, and he says, let me see that. And he's reading this, and he says, this is outrageous. I'm not going to sign this. And then he's nose to nose arguing with these people, and I had to be almost like the referee in between here. And then afterwards I reimagined the whole scene with Cardinal Bernardine, and it would have been somebody coming up with a clipboard, and he would have said, "Oh, well, this is not the proper time or place. Please call Monsignor Vilo and make an appointment. We can talk about this later." But Cardinal George was like, "No, man." So, but that's his prophetic voice, is that he didn't hold back. If he had something to say, he let people know that. Another insight into the way he talked was that he had this ongoing banter with one of the TV reporters in Chicago, Jay Levine, and Jay would always ask him how he felt about something, and Cardinal George would say, "Jay, don't ask me how I feel about something. Ask me what I think." And then even one of the last interviews they had, he was dealing with his cancer and his illness, and Jay asks him how he feels, and he pounds the table. He said, "Jay, I've been telling you for years, don't ask me what I feel, ask me what I think." And that's he was a profound thinker, but he did have strong feelings. He had very strong feelings. I saw that personally with the death of Bishop Edwin Conway, his Vicar General, and he was very, very choked up about that. In a more humorous vein, I also saw his sentimental attachment to his laundry bag that he received when he was a novice. You wrote about that, and you wrote about that he left it in New York, and he called Cardinal Dolan to make sure he found this laundry bag. So this was, again, another trip I was taking with him. We're going to Rome, and I was supposed to meet him at the residence like at 2 o'clock, and then we're going to go to the airport. So I get there a little before 2. He's not there. He's running from some other appointment. So he comes running in the door. He says, "Come on upstairs. You got to help me pack." So I go upstairs. We're in his room, and he's handing me things to throw in the suitcase, and he gives me this tattered laundry bag. And I said to him, "Your Eminence, we can get you a new laundry bag." He said, "I have a sentimental attachment to that bag. I've had it since novitiate. Put it in the bag." Okay. Just a couple more things I want to mention here. His prophetic side, again, when he was president of the USCCB, how bishops would listen to him very attentively when he spoke. And one of those occasions when he raised his voice in a prophetic manner was in 2010 with the proposals in the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. It was mandating employers to provide abortifacient and contraceptive drugs in their employees' health insurance plans. And he spoke out not only to the Obama administration and government officials, but also to the leadership of the Catholic Health Association for contradicting the position of the U.S. bishops. As the president of the USCCB, he also issued a statement declaring New Way's ministry confuses the faithful regarding the authentic teaching and ministry of the church with respect to persons with a homosexual inclination. Finally, I would say this. Michael mentioned this, the Eucharistic prayer, the use of the word oblation. And that, I also heard that that word is in the Eucharistic prayer because of his connection being an oblate missionary of the Mary Immaculate, that he was very involved in the translations with ISIL and with Vox Clara. And so you priests here, whenever you say the Eucharistic prayer and you come across the word oblation, you can thank Cardinal George for that. But oblation is basically the offering of yourself and what we offer. And so he offered his life. And in the homily at the funeral mass of Cardinal George, Archbishop Peter Sarton summed up the oblation of Cardinal George and his life in this succinct sentence. He said, "He offered a brilliant mind and love with God." That was him. Brilliant mind, but he had a heart of loving God. And so in my homily this past March 19th, on my 20th anniversary of being ordained a bishop by Cardinal George, I concluded, and I want to conclude my remarks here by saying, I would not be the bishop I am today without the excellent example, mentoring, and continued intercession of this saintly man. May he rest in peace, and may he continue to guide and inspire us to glorify Christ and his church. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop.
Well, those are two very difficult acts to follow, but I'll try to just add some, I guess, color and context to some of the things that Michael and Bishop Paprocki have already pointed out. I served as Cardinal George's executive assistant for about 8 years. I had been Bishop Paprocki's vice chancellor, and then Cardinal George appointed me to be his executive assistant, which essentially meant I kind of ran the day-to-day operations in the office. So we had a pretty big staff. We had 7 full-time staff for the Cardinal's work itself, and then a separate scheduling staff. We had 3 people who just did the scheduling because he was so in demand for talks and this. I mean, and not just within the United States, but all over the world, as Bishop and Michael have mentioned. So when the day that he was named the new Archbishop of Chicago, and remember, Chicago was still very sad about the death of Cardinal Bernardine, who died a very brave death and really modeled a way to die without fear and loving Christ. And so, Chicagoans it's a very Catholic city, and so there was all the reporters were trying to find out who the new Archbishop was going to be. So the Chicago Tribune had 10 mock-ups of front pages ready to go. And because there were, everybody always talks, and that Patty Power, whatever, takes bets on who, you give 10-to-1 odds on this person or that person. And number 10 was Cardinal George. And part of the reason for that is that the Holy Father had just made him Archbishop of Portland 9 months earlier. So you generally don't move someone from a archdiocesan see to a cardinalatial see in less than a year. That just generally doesn't happen, but Cardinal George was such a unique person in the church, such a brilliant mind, that exception was made for him. So we knew from the beginning that he had to be a very special person. So the opening press conference that Bishop Paprocki has also mentioned, the reporters were very much kind of trying to be, and not all of them, but some of them kind of contentious, trying to already create this sort of dichotomy between him and Cardinal Bernardine, because they're pastoral they're just very different people, right? And who is it? Aquinas says grace builds on nature, and you had a slightly cantankerous Chicagoan and a Southern gentleman. So, and the gifts that they brought were different just because of who they were as people. So, but one of them, a not particularly bright reporter, who was young, and she would agree with me even now, I'm sure, if she heard me say this, said, now what are you going to do about, the women who want to be priests? Some really question that, just she shouldn't have asked at an opening press conference. And so he looks at her and without, he wasn't talking down to her, just without hesitation. He said, well, what you're really talking about is epistemological dissonance. And when you have epistemological dissonance, and you know that line in scripture, and no one dared to ask him any other questions. So it was very much like that. So, you knew from the beginning you had somebody quick on his feet and who had a vocabulary. People would, walk around with a thesaurus after him or a dictionary trying to figure out what he was saying sometimes. But he never, he really did have, I think, a genius level IQ, but he knew he was always the smartest person in the room, but he never spoke down to anybody. I never saw it once in the 8 years I was with him practically every day, except sometimes on weekends, but mostly not on weekends. But I want to just tell you, a little bit about the kind of person he was to work for, the personal care that he really showed for everybody who worked in the pastoral center with him, and his auxiliary bishops, as Bishop Paprocki mentioned. That's very unusual, as Bishop points out, for the cardinal himself to make that phone call. Normally, that is the nuncio does that, but the cardinal did have the prerogative, and that just shows you kind of the fraternal love that he had for everybody who served with him as an auxiliary bishop. But there was one of my daughters was born in the middle of the summer, and the kind of rule of thumb in our office is you couldn't take a vacation day if it was a day the cardinal was in the office the whole day, because it was just too busy. It's too hard on the staff. It's all hands on deck if he's in the office, because he was kind of a paper tornado, and so we just needed everyone. But it was my daughter's birthday, and so I had permission to, and I was having some kind of pool party, in the backyard, and I'm getting the things together. It was about 10 in the morning. The phone rings. This is kind of before cell phones, and she picks up the phone, and she said, "Yes, it is my birthday." And, well, I'm having Susie and Jeannie, and so she's going through all the names, and Mom got me a My Little Pony cake. And then, so I'm thinking, it's Grandma, right? So Grandma's just calling. So I'm in the basement, and 10 minutes later, I am not joking, she's going through the whole details of the whole day here. Mom, Cardinal's on the phone. And so, he talked to her for 10 minutes about her birthday, about this 4-year-old, about her My Little Pony cake and her birthday party. So, that was, he just had this, he loved children, he really did, and could really relate to them. He knew the right questions to ask. He was really interested in her. And then, this will be the only of my 2 personal stories about him. My youngest daughter was born prematurely with a lung condition that I was just in for a routine ultrasound. You might remember, you may have been gone, I can't remember, maybe you were still there, but we had a staff meeting that afternoon, so I'm looking at my watch, and the ultrasound guy goes out, and he comes back in, he's like, I'm just going to take a few more pictures today. And then immediately I thought something's wrong, and something was wrong, and a duct in her lung had burst. Anyway, long story short, I go to the meeting, I say to the cardinal, I think I'm having this baby tomorrow. And he was very concerned. He was very kind. It's the middle of January. It's bad weather in Chicago. And so I go in, and, sure enough, they did have to deliver me that day. And that night, I'm lying in the hospital bed, and they delivered her. She was in the NICU and had to stay there for quite a while. But I hear these, it's 10 o'clock at night, and I'm kind of staring at the ceiling, and I hear these footsteps coming down the hall. And he had a particular gait because of the brace that he wore on his leg. And I thought, dear Lord, that cannot be him at 10 o'clock at night after I have just had a baby. And sure enough, the door opens, and there he is. And he said, I just came to see how the baby was doing. And he didn't ask anything about me, which I thought was kind of funny as well. So anyway, I'm like, I'm fine. So they took him down to the NICU, and, he blessed her, and he prayed over her. And the particular condition that she had is called bilateral pleural effusions. And they had told us, it's likely she's going to have surgery on her lungs and blah, blah, blah. And within 3 weeks, all the fluid in her lungs had absorbed back in on its own, and they didn't have to do the surgery. And they told us at discharging her, this is like a 1 in a 1,000 thing that we see. We never see it resolve this quickly. So they attribute it to him praying. So I thought, so that was kind of a nice story, and it's a nice thing for her baby book and all that. But it does give you a sense of just, who he was. But to go back to the beginning, and this has been alluded to, he had applied to Quigley Seminary, which was our high school seminary, Quigley North at the time. We actually had 2 high school seminaries, South and North, and it was downtown. And the building did, in fairness, the building did have a lot of stairs, and it was difficult to navigate. But he really wanted to go to Quigley. He wanted to be a priest. He felt that call, he said, the day of his first communion. And so he applied to Quigley. Of course, he, aced the entrance exam, but they rejected him. So he was rejected by Quigley, and he always publicly was very kind, and he was always so careful to protect the reputations of others. He felt very serious about calumny, about not speaking negatively about others in public unless it was necessary, and he really practiced that in person. But he said, that they told my parents they were concerned about the stairs and that I couldn't, with my brace, make the 2 bus transfer, et cetera, et cetera. But I wound up being at a program with him. It was for young leaders in Chicago, where they got to it was just kind of an open mic thing. And that was really his strong suit. He was very good in questions and answers because he was so smart. But there was one young man who identified as a Catholic, and so he said, I'd like to ask you a question. I want to be very frank with you. And, he loved that, right? So he liked to go mano a mano with people. And so he said, my priest, my pastor says, there's 2 kind of priests in the world. There's priests who want to work with the poor, and then there's priests who want to be bishops. Which one are you? Okay, and so remember, so he didn't go to Quigley. I'm sorry, I have to backtrack a little bit. He went to the seminary, St. Henry's Seminary for the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, which was in Belleville, Illinois, southern Illinois. And that was all on one level. It was like a big ranch-style building, so there weren't stairs. He could manage it. And the Oblates came to interview his parents, and they said, if he can walk from that corner to that podium, we will take him. And of course he could get up and he could do it. So he went there and went to study with the Oblates. So at the time, remember, Bishop, you might know this exactly, when the Holy Father, up until that time, religious order priests were not made bishops, right? So you were either a diocesan priest and you were on a bishop track if you wanted to, I guess. But if you chose a religious order, you were intentionally choosing, you would never be a bishop. So he said, oh, well, that's a very good question. He said, I'll tell you about 2 conscious decisions I made when I was 13 years old. I joined the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, so I knew I would never be a bishop. And when I joined the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the rule in the community was that you were never sent back to your home diocese. So I knew I would never come back to Chicago. Those were the 2 conscious decisions. And he said, yet here I am. And he said, so, God sometimes has other plans and will reroute your life to get you where he wanted to be. But he really did make that decision. He never, if you had asked him, even as a young priest, will you ever be the Archbishop of Chicago? He would have laughed and said, it's not possible. I'm not going to get sent back to Chicago by my order, and the Holy Father doesn't make bishops of religious order men. So I love that sort of whole, God getting you where he needs you to be, despite what the obstacles, and he was such a living example of that. So he had an incredible work ethic, sometimes more than we as staff would have liked. I told the story last night at dinner of how there was a Christmas, and the staff on December 23rd would be dismissed at noon, but Cardinal George always wanted to see every piece of his mail. He always felt that if someone had taken the time to write a letter to him, that person deserved a response. And so until every letter had been opened and read and a response either partially dictated or prepared for him, he didn't leave. So it was about 5 o'clock. And again, it's 5 o'clock, December 23rd. It's me, the priest secretary, and I think one of my secretaries who was waiting there. And the Cardinal started calling people, like at their desks. And he called me and he said, Mary, no one is picking up their phones. I said, Cardinal, you and me and Deanne are the only people here in this entire building. And he said, he was like, oh, oh, well, you should go home then. And I said, okay, I guess I'll do that then. But, he also had an incredible gift for languages, which I think some people don't know. He spoke 6 languages fluently. His best language was French. And so when he served at that synod, as you talked about, Bishop, with he was next to John Paul II. What was his role? He was not the translator, but he was advising John. He was advisor to John Paul. Right, and so they spoke to each other in French because that was each other's best foreign language. And we had the privilege of the French ambassador to the United States coming to Chicago, and who came to visit the chapel at the Quigley Pastoral Center, where our offices are, which is a scale model of Sainte-Chapelle. And so the French government had actually sent one of their stained glass experts to help us repair one of the windows. Because I don't know what it is about the window, but there's like 3 people in the whole world that know how to fix it. And so the government actually sent their person. So as a thank you, the French ambassador came. So I had to escort the French ambassador into the office, which was a privilege for me. And the Cardinal stood up and went over and greeted him in French. And they had the French ambassador, I don't think, was A, expecting that, or B, appreciated it because, they send their best and brightest to be. He's not the ambassador to the U.S. if he has bad English. And so, but the French was the language of his community, so it was the language of the house. So that's what they spoke, among the oblates. And so his was very good. And as I walked the French ambassador out, he turned to me. The very first thing he said to me as we were walking out, he said, au revoir, and he turned to me and said, his French is perfect. And I just thought that was such a great compliment from the French ambassador to the Cardinal about how perfect his language was. It's been referenced, his love for Catholic education and Catholic schools, that he would do anything not to close a Catholic school. I mean, he would wait. And, he was very emphatic that Catholic schools exist to teach Catholic children the Catholic faith. We will take anyone. But passing on the faith, that's why we need Catholic schools. It's a great part of our mission, not only forming intellectually capable people, but also people who are virtuous and who are kind, but who know and love the Lord. And the statement that stands out most to me that I recall is when you close a Catholic school, you close a child's world. And he felt very important. So that was really something he emphasized tremendously. And so I'll just close with two stories of death. They came kind of close together. When John Paul II died, one of the memories that he recounted after, that beautiful funeral, and remember, all of the cardinals walked into St. Peter's and they lined the aisle, and then those bearing the casket brought the casket in, the doors closed, and it was just them. And it was complete silence. And I'll try to tell the story without crying. And one of the things you do, if you are a bishop or a cardinal, you go in to see the Holy Father. As a sign of respect, you take your zacchetto off, and you greet the Holy Father, and then you put it back on again, and you have your meeting. So just as the casket was coming down the aisle, just one by one, they took off their zucchettos and then put them back on as the casket passed them. And when the Cardinal told me that story, he started to cry, of course, and I started. It was a hot mess in the office. We were all crying. But I just thought, that last moment of reverence, because, and he said he really was a special man. He was a saint. He said these kinds of people come along. But to share that very intimate detail about what those final moments with the Holy Father's body going along. And then just before he died, when he would have been in a wheelchair at this point, I was over at the residence visiting with him, and there was a question because of the new Archbishop's schedule whether or not he could go to the March for Life. And that was a very important thing on the Cardinal's schedule, to be at that March for Life every year. And he's in a wheelchair at this point, and he said, Mary, if he is unable to go, then I will go. Someone has to be with those kids. And I thought, the poor man could be, but he was serious. I mean, this was not like, he was dead serious, and his priest secretary is looking at me like, oh no, what have you done? But as it happens, the Archbishop was able to go. But that's how strongly Cardinal George felt about that particular, and being present, not just the issue itself, but being present to it. And then finally, he was a man, who was born into a Chicago family. And I think one of the last, he always talks about Jesus being born into a family with a mother and a father and with grandparents, and with, and the importance of the first way you know the Lord is through your family. And instead of being buried in the bishop's mausoleum, he's buried next to his mom and dad. at Queen of Heaven Cemetery. And so you can just, and he said to me, you can just drive up and come and say, hello to me whenever you want. Well, people do. That's the one interesting thing. So I stop by from time to time. I go to the grave just to say hello and what have you and talk to them about some things. And there's always somebody there. Almost always there's someone there. And someone's left. Sometimes people have left kind of tacky things, which I have deputized myself to remove. Because he would have wanted me to. But I think that was sort of his last message to us, that you are part of a family. This is how you come to know the Lord. And that, he has a beautiful headstone, of course, but he's with his mom and dad and his Aunt Lucy on the other side. His grandma, sorry, yeah. But he's with his family. So, and then we'd be happy to take your questions, I think. So.
Thank you, Mary.
Folks, at 6 o'clock, we're not going to be able to do questions. But these folks here know an awfully lot about the Cardinal. Track them down, ask them questions. But for everybody's benefit, I think we need to close this at this juncture because we've already gone about 10 or 15 minutes over. But read the book. It's beautifully written, for one thing, by a real pro, and the level of detail is extraordinary. I'll tell one very, very quick story. My Archbishop and the Cardinal were named archbishops within a few days of each other. And Archbishop, then Archbishop George, stopped on his way to Chicago, where he was going to be announced, to attend the installation of Archbishop Chaput. And that was the kind of guy he was. I mean, he just had a heart as big as Texas. I mean, really, literally, he was just a great guy. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all.
Please, if you have questions, please pursue these people.
And bye.
Thanks very much.